The restaurant fell silent as Colonel Robert Carter stood from his chair, his weathered face solemn as he raised his right hand in a crisp military salute. Across the room, James Harrison, disheveled in his worn blazer, the scar along his jawline catching the dim light, straightened instinctively, returning the gesture with practiced precision. Between them stood Melissa, the colonel's daughter, her mocking laughter dying in her throat as realization crashed over her like ice water. 15 minutes earlier, she had walked out on this same man, this single father she dismissed as not worth her time. Now, watching her father's eyes fill with respect for the stranger she'd humiliated, Melissa felt the ground shift beneath her perfectly polished heels. If you've ever judged someone before knowing their full story, this video might just change your perspective forever. Hit that like button and subscribe now to catch more life-changing moments that remind us what true character looks like. This isn't just another story, it's a wake-up call about judgment, sacrifice, and the invisible battles people fight every day. James Harrison stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. At 34, the lines around his eyes seemed to have deepened overnight. 8 years in the Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and 3 years as a single father had aged him beyond his years. "Daddy, you look handsome." 8-year-old Sophie bounced on her toes in the doorway, her missing front tooth creating a whistling lisp that made James smile despite his nerves. "You think so, Soph?" He adjusted his tie for the 4th time, wincing as he stretched the scar tissue along his right shoulder. The shrapnel wounds had healed years ago, but weather changes still brought the pain roaring back. "Ms. Emma said you're meeting a princess." Sophie twirled in her pajamas. "Will she be my new mommy?" James knelt down, his knees cracking in protest. "Hey now, remember what we talked about? This is just dinner with a friend of Emma's. Like a play date, but for grown-ups. A play date where you get dressed up and smell like the fancy soap Grandma gave you for Christmas." Sophie wrinkled her nose. James laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. It had been a long time since he'd had reason to laugh freely. Since Laura died 3 years ago, taking with her the future they'd planned and leaving him to raise their daughter alone, joy had become something fleeting, precious, and rare. "Mrs. Gonzalez will be here any minute to stay with you." He kissed Sophie's forehead. "Bedtime is still 8:30, even if I'm not home. Promise you'll be good?" "Cross my heart," Sophie said solemnly, making the gesture over her unicorn pajamas. "Daddy? I hope your friend likes you. You deserve someone nice." James swallowed the sudden lump in his throat. "Thanks, sweetheart. I love you a million." "Love you a billion," Sophie replied, their familiar exchange warming the cold corners of his heart. The doorbell rang, and James took a deep breath. Mrs. Gonzalez from next door had been a lifesaver since Laura passed, watching Sophie whenever his teaching schedule at Jefferson High ran late or on the rare occasions, like tonight, when he attempted to have some semblance of a personal life. After settling Sophie with her babysitter and promising to be home by 10, James climbed into his aging Toyota Corolla. The car had seen better days, much like himself, but it was reliable. The radio played softly as he navigated through the streets of Alexandria, Virginia, wondering for the 1000th time why he'd agreed to this blind date. Emma Rodriguez had been persistent. As the school counselor at Jefferson High where James taught history, she'd watched him pour himself into his work and daughter for 3 years without taking a single evening for himself. "James," she'd said last week, cornering him in the faculty lounge, "my friend Melissa is smart, successful, and hasn't found a decent man in this city. You're a good man who deserves happiness. Just dinner. What's the worst that could happen?" James could think of plenty of worst-case scenarios as he pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Bistro, an upscale restaurant overlooking the Potomac that was definitely outside his budget. But Emma had insisted this was Melissa's favorite place, and he wanted to make a good impression. As he checked his phone before heading inside, a text from Emma appeared, "Melissa's running 15 minutes late. She's coming straight from work. You've got this." "Great. More time to sit alone with his anxiety. Across town, Melissa Carter tapped her manicured nails impatiently against her steering wheel, cursing the traffic on the Beltway. At 30, she had built a reputation as one of the most formidable marketing executives at Horizon Dynamics. Today's client meeting had run long, leaving her barely enough time to refresh her makeup before this blind date Emma had been pushing for weeks. "He's different," Emma had promised. "Not like those finance bros you usually date." Melissa wasn't sure different was what she needed right now. Her biological clock wasn't just ticking, it was practically setting off alarm bells. Her last 3 relationships had ended disastrously, each man revealing fatal flaws, too self-absorbed, too uncommitted, too intimidated by her success. Her phone rang through her car's Bluetooth, her father's name lighting up the display. "Hi, Dad," she answered, accelerating as traffic finally cleared. "Melissa, are you still coming to dinner on Sunday?" Colonel Robert Carter's voice was as commanding over the phone as it was in person. "Your mother's making her pot roast. Wouldn't miss it." Melissa smiled despite her rush. Her relationship with her father had always been complicated, his military strictness clashing with her independent streak, but they'd found their footing in her adulthood. "I'm actually headed to a date right now." "Another one?" She could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Who is it this time?" "Someone Emma knows." "A teacher, I think." "A teacher?" Her father sounded genuinely interested. "That's different for you." "That's what Emma said." Melissa checked her lipstick in the rearview mirror as she pulled into the restaurant parking lot. "Look, Dad, I'm here now. I'll call you tomorrow." "Good luck, Melissa. And remember what I always say. Character is revealed in actions, not words," she finished, having heard this maxim throughout her childhood. "Love you, Dad." Melissa checked her appearance one final time before entering Riverside Bistro. Her navy blue dress hugged her curves perfectly, her blonde hair falling in careful waves around her shoulders. She was running almost 20 minutes late now, but a strategic entrance was always better than appearing too eager. The maitre d' led her through the elegant dining room. "Your party is already seated, Miss Carter." Melissa followed, scanning the tables for someone matching Emma's description: tall, dark hair, kind eyes. What she saw instead made her steps falter. At a corner table sat a man who looked like he'd wandered in from a different world entirely. His blazer was decent but clearly well worn, his haircut simple and utilitarian. But what caught her attention was the scar, a jagged line running from his right ear down his jawline. As he stood to greet her, she noticed he moved with a slight stiffness, his smile uncertain. "Melissa?" he asked, his voice deeper than she expected. "I'm James Harrison." She shook his outstretched hand automatically, noticing the calluses against her smooth palm. "Yes, hi. Sorry I'm late. Work was crazy." She slid into her seat, already calculating how quickly she could exit this obvious mismatch. "No problem. I understand busy schedules." He sat back down, wincing slightly as he shifted in his chair. The waiter appeared, and Melissa ordered a glass of Cabernet, desperately needing alcohol to get through what was already shaping up to be a waste of her evening. "So, Emma tells me you're a teacher," she began, falling back on practiced first-date questions. "History, at Jefferson High." James nodded. "I've been there for about 4 years now." "That's nice." Melissa took a large sip of her wine when it arrived. Public school teaching wasn't exactly the ambitious career she'd imagined in a partner. "And before that?" "Marine Corps. 8 years." His answer was matter-of-fact, without the bravado some military men displayed. This detail piqued her interest slightly. "What made you leave?" Something flickered across his face, pain, perhaps, or reluctance. "My wife was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. I took a hardship discharge to be with her and our daughter." Melissa nearly choked on her wine. You have a daughter? Sophie. She's 8. His face softened. The light of my life. And your wife? Melissa let the question hang, though she already suspected the answer. She passed away 3 years ago. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Melissa's mind raced. A widower. A single father. A teacher with a scarred face and a military background. This wasn't just a bad match, it was a complete disaster. Emma had set her up with a walking charity case. I'm sorry for your loss, she said automatically, the words hollow even to her own ears. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and she seized the opportunity. Excuse me, I need to check this. There was no emergency message, but Melissa had long ago perfected the urgent work crisis escape plan. She looked up at James with manufactured regret. I am so sorry, but there's an issue with a major client account. I need to make some calls. James nodded, disappointment evident in his eyes. Of course. We could reschedule. I'll have to check my calendar. Melissa gathered her purse and stood. This might take a while, so you should go ahead and enjoy your dinner. Are you sure? I don't mind waiting. His sincerity only made her feel worse, which in turn hardened her resolve to leave. No, really. I could be on calls all night. It was nice meeting you. As she walked away, relieved to have extricated herself from the awkward situation, Melissa couldn't help but laugh softly to herself. What had Emma been thinking? A widowed single father with obvious financial constraints and physical damage was about as far from her type as possible. She was looking for someone successful, ambitious, whole, not someone who needed saving. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she almost collided with an older couple entering the restaurant. Excuse me, The words died in her throat as she recognized her parents. Melissa? Her mother looked surprised. What are you doing here? I thought you had a date. Before she could formulate a response, her father's gaze moved past her to the corner table, where James still sat, now staring down at an untouched glass of water. Is that him? Colonel Robert Carter asked, his brow furrowing. Dad, it's not, I was just leaving because. But Colonel Carter was already moving past her, his posture straightening as he approached the table. Melissa followed helplessly, her mother trailing behind with a confused expression. James looked up as the colonel stopped before his table. Recognition flashed across his face, and he immediately stood at attention, his posture transforming despite whatever pain it caused him. Staff Sergeant James Harrison, her father said, not a question but a statement. Yes, sir. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. James's voice had changed, taking on a crispness Melissa hadn't heard during their brief conversation. Her father's face remained impassive for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that stunned Melissa, Colonel Robert Carter raised his hand in a formal salute. James returned it perfectly, the movement clearly ingrained in muscle memory. I presented you with the Silver Star at Bethesda in 2015, her father said after lowering his hand. You pulled 3 of your men to safety after your vehicle hit an IED, despite your own injuries. Just doing my job, sir, James replied quietly. Your commanding officer said you refused evacuation until all your men were accounted for. Said you continued giving orders with shrapnel in your shoulder and face, keeping pressure on Private Rodriguez's femoral artery until the medevac arrived. Melissa stood frozen, the reality of what she was hearing slowly sinking in. This was the story behind the scar she had found so off-putting, behind the slight wince when he moved. Rodriguez made it home to his family because of you, her father continued. I remember these things, Sergeant Harrison. It's just James now, sir. And thank you for remembering. Her father nodded, then turned to Melissa with an expression she hadn't seen since she was a little girl who had disappointed him deeply. Melissa, would you care to explain why you're leaving your date with Sergeant Harrison? The restaurant seemed to have gone quiet around them, or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in Melissa's ears. Shame washed over her as she realized what this looked like, what it was. She had judged this man based on his appearance, his profession, his circumstances, without knowing anything about his character. There was a work emergency, she stammered, the lie transparent even to her own ears. Her father raised an eyebrow, seeing through her as easily as he always had. A work emergency that had you laughing to yourself as you walked out? Melissa felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. Dad, Robert, her mother interjected gently, placing a hand on her husband's arm. Perhaps we should give them a moment. Colonel Carter looked from his wife to James, then back to Melissa. We'll take a different table. Sergeant, James, it was an honor to see you again. The honor is mine, sir, James replied, the dignity in his bearing making Melissa feel increasingly small. As her parents moved away to speak with the maitre d', Melissa stood awkwardly by the table, acutely aware of the curious glances from nearby diners. You don't have to stay, James said quietly. I understand this isn't what you expected. His kindness only made her feel worse. James, I'm sorry. I didn't know. That I was a hero, he finished, a hint of edge finally entering his voice. I'm not. I'm just someone who did what needed doing when it counted. But that's not why you were leaving, was it? Melissa sank back into her chair, unable to meet his eyes. I made assumptions. I was shallow and judgmental. You're not the first, James said with a shrug that belied the hurt in his eyes. Dating as a single dad with visible scars and a teacher's salary. I've gotten used to disappointment. That doesn't make what I did okay, Melissa replied, finally looking up at him. My father taught me better than that. A small smile touched James's lips. He seems like a good man. He is. And he clearly thinks the same of you. Melissa took a deep breath. Would it be completely inappropriate to ask if we could start over? James studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she deserved a second chance. Finally, he extended his hand across the table. James Harrison. I teach history and have an 8-year-old daughter who thinks I'm meeting a princess tonight. Melissa felt something catch in her chest as she took his hand. Melissa Carter. Definitely not a princess, but hoping to be a better person than I was 15 minutes ago. Across the restaurant, Colonel Robert and Margaret Carter watched their daughter and the soldier from their own table. Do you think she'll learn from this? Margaret asked, sipping her water. Robert watched as Melissa laughed genuinely at something James said, her body language transformed from the stiff discomfort of earlier to genuine engagement. She's her mother's daughter, stubborn as hell, he said with a fond smile. But she's got my sense of right and wrong buried under all that ambition. Sometimes we just need to be reminded of who we really are. And who is Sergeant Harrison? Margaret asked. Beyond the heroics you mentioned. Robert's expression grew thoughtful. The kind of man they don't make enough of anymore. Someone who understands that courage isn't about not being afraid, but about doing what's right even when you are. He glanced at his wife. The kind of man I'd be proud to see with our daughter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. After one salute and a 15-year-old memory? Character reveals itself in moments of crisis, Maggie. Always has. He smiled as he watched Melissa lean forward, clearly engaged in whatever James was saying. And sometimes, it takes one crisis to prevent another. 3 months later, James stood nervously at the doorway of his classroom, watching students file out after the final bell. His tie felt too tight, his palms sweaty. You look like you're about to face a firing squad, not propose to my daughter. James turned to find Colonel Carter, call me Robert, son, leaning against the wall outside his classroom. Is it that obvious, sir? James asked, adjusting his tie for the 10th time that hour. Only to someone who's been there. Robert straightened James's tie with practiced ease. The ring? James patted his pocket. Right here. Do you think she suspects anything? Melissa is brilliant at marketing strategy but terrible at surprise parties. She has no idea. Robert's expression grew serious. Are you sure you're ready for this? It's been a whirlwind few months. James thought about the question carefully, respecting the man enough to give him an honest answer. When Laura died, I thought that part of my life was over. I focused entirely on Sophie and my students. But Melissa... He smiled. She bulldozed her way past all my defenses. Sophie adores her. And I've never met anyone who makes me want to be better while accepting me exactly as I am. Robert nodded, satisfied. She said something similar about you. That you were the first man who didn't either try to change her or fold under her strength. I've faced Taliban fighters, sir. Your daughter is terrifying in an entirely different league. James laughed. Well, let's get you to the restaurant. Sophie is already there with Margaret, helping with the decorations. As they walked toward the parking lot, James thought about how much his life had changed since that night 3 months ago. From the disaster of a beginning, Melissa walking out laughing, only to return humbled by her father's recognition of him, to weekly dinners that turned into daily phone calls, to Sophie declaring that, Ms. Melissa tells the best bedtime stories ever, even better than you, Daddy. Melissa had proven herself to be nothing like his first impression. Behind her polished exterior and corporate ambition was a woman of depth, compassion, and unexpected vulnerability. She had integrated herself into their lives with a determination that amazed him, never shying away from the challenges of dating a man with an 8-year-old daughter and emotional scars that matched his physical ones. What are you thinking about? Robert asked as they reached his car. How one moment can change everything, James replied. If you and Mrs. Carter hadn't walked into that restaurant at exactly that moment. Robert clapped him on the shoulder. Life is full of those moments, son. The trick is recognizing them when they happen. At Riverside Bistro, the same restaurant where it had all begun, Melissa sat with Sophie, helping the little girl arrange rose petals on the private dining room table. Do you think Daddy will be surprised? Sophie asked, her gap-toothed smile wide with excitement. I think he'll be very surprised, Melissa replied, though not for the reasons Sophie believed. As far as the child knew, they were planning a surprise birthday party for James, whose birthday was still 2 months away. Will you live with us after you marry Daddy? Sophie asked casually, dropping another handful of petals. Melissa froze. What makes you think we're getting married? Sophie rolled her eyes in the dramatic way only 8-year-olds can perfect. I found the ring box in Daddy's sock drawer when I was helping with laundry. It's so pretty. There's a big diamond and little blue stones that look like my eyes, Daddy said. Melissa's heart skipped a beat. Sophie Harrison, have you been keeping secrets from me? The little girl shrugged. Daddy made me pinky promise. And you always say promises are important. Melissa laughed, pulling Sophie into a hug. Yes, they absolutely are. As they finished decorating, Melissa reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The shame she'd felt that night 3 months ago had been transformative, forcing her to confront her own prejudices and shallow values. Dating James had challenged everything she thought she wanted in a partner. His quiet strength, his dedication to his daughter and students, his resilience in the face of loss, all had shown her what true character looked like. She'd fallen in love not with the hero her father had saluted, but with the man who read Sophie bedtime stories in different voices for each character, who stayed up late grading papers to leave thoughtful comments for struggling students, who looked at Melissa as if she were a miracle even when she showed up at his door in sweatpants with no makeup after a terrible day at work. They're here. Sophie squealed, peeking out the window. Melissa's mother appeared from the kitchen, carrying a cake. Places, everyone. As footsteps approached the private dining room, Melissa felt a flutter of anticipation. She knew what was coming, thanks to Sophie's intel, but the knowledge didn't diminish her excitement. The door opened, and James stepped in, looking handsome in a new suit she'd helped him pick out last month. His face registered surprise at the decorated room, then broke into a wide smile when Sophie ran to him. "Happy fake birthday, Daddy!" Sophie yelled, throwing her arms around his waist. James looked confused, then caught Melissa's eye over Sophie's head. The connection between them was instant and electric, as it had been since that night they'd started over. "What's all this?" he asked, taking in the roses, the candles, the small gathering of their closest friends and family. Melissa approached him, taking his hands in hers. "This was supposed to be your surprise, but apparently someone," she glanced meaningfully at Sophie, "has been keeping secrets." Understanding dawned on James's face, followed by alarm. "Sophie, did you?" "I didn't tell her what the ring looked like," Sophie protested. "Just that I found it." The room filled with laughter, and James shook his head, his carefully planned proposal clearly derailed. But instead of looking disappointed, he smiled. "Well, since the surprise is out." He reached into his pocket and lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly as his old injuries protested. Melissa felt tears spring to her eyes as he opened the small velvet box, revealing exactly what Sophie had described, a diamond surrounded by small sapphires that matched both Sophie's and James's eyes. "Melissa Carter, 3 months ago you walked out of this restaurant laughing, thinking I wasn't worth your time." His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then you came back and gave me a chance to show you who I really am. You've brought joy back into our lives when I thought it was gone forever. Sophie and I both love you more than we can say. Will you marry me and make our family complete?" Through her tears, Melissa nodded. "Yes," she managed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." As James slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the small crowd erupted in applause. Sophie wedged herself between them, creating a group hug that made Melissa's heart feel too full for her chest. Over James's shoulder, she caught her father's eye. Colonel Robert Carter stood tall and proud, watching the scene with visible emotion. As their eyes met, he gave her a small nod of approval that meant more to her than any words could express. Later, as they shared cake and champagne, Melissa found a moment alone with her father on the restaurant's terrace. "Thank you," she said simply, looking out at the Potomac River glittering in the evening light. "For what?" he asked, though she suspected he knew. "For teaching me to see beyond the surface. For recognizing the man I almost walked away from." Robert smiled, his weathered face softening. "You would have figured it out eventually. You're smarter than I was at your age." "I'm not so sure about that." Melissa twisted her new engagement ring, still getting used to its weight. "I almost made the biggest mistake of my life that night." "But you didn't." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's the thing about character, Melissa. It can be built, shaped, improved. Your mother and I raised you with values. They were always there, even if they got buried for a while under ambition and expectations." Through the terrace doors, they could see James lifting Sophie onto his shoulders, the little girl's laughter visible even if they couldn't hear it. "He's a good man," Robert said. "The kind who stands tall when it matters." "I know." Melissa smiled. "And he's teaching me to do the same." 1 year later, Melissa sat in the audience of Jefferson High School's auditorium, watching James accept the Teacher of the Year award. Sophie sat beside her, proudly wearing a "World's Best Daughter" t-shirt that matched Melissa's "World's Best Stepmom" shirt, gag gifts from James on their 6-month wedding anniversary. "My husband is pretty amazing, isn't he?" Melissa whispered to Sophie. "The amazingest," Sophie agreed, her 9-year-old vocabulary still creative. "Are you going to tell him tonight?" Melissa placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "After the ceremony. It'll be the perfect ending to a perfect day." As James finished his acceptance speech, humble as always, crediting his students and colleagues rather than taking praise for himself, his eyes found Melissa and Sophie in the crowd. The love in his gaze was so palpable that Melissa felt it like a physical warmth. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed and they sat on the porch swing of the house they'd bought together, Melissa told him about the baby. James's joy was everything she'd hoped for, his strong arms holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he confessed, his hand gently resting on her stomach. "After Laura died, I thought that part of my life was over." "I know." Melissa leaned into his embrace. "Sometimes I think about how close I came to missing all of this." "Because you walked out laughing?" James teased. The memory had lost its sting, becoming instead an inside joke, a reminder of how far they'd come. "Because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me." She turned to face him. "Thank God for my father and his perfect timing." James smiled, the scar on his jaw catching the soft porch light. "I've learned that life gives us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. Sometimes it comes in strange packages, like a blind date that goes terribly wrong before it goes wonderfully right. Or a scar-faced history teacher with an adorable daughter," Melissa added, kissing the jagged line along his jaw that she now found beautiful. "We're going to have a baby," James whispered, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby," Melissa confirmed. "And Sophie is going to be the best big sister ever." As they sat there in the quiet evening, Melissa thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a disastrous blind date to a family growing in love and number, all because her father had recognized true character when he saw it and hadn't been afraid to acknowledge it with a salute that changed everything. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important moments in life aren't the big, dramatic ones, but the small gestures that redirect our paths when we least expect it. A salute. A second chance. A willingness to see beyond appearances to the heart of what matters. And sometimes, the happy endings we're meant for come disguised as the disappointments we think we don't deserve. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more content that reminds us of the power of second chances and seeing beyond appearances. Share your thoughts in the comments below about a time when you misjudged someone or were given a second chance that changed everything. Remember, true character isn't about perfection, it's about how we respond when life tests us in unexpected ways.